Jane and her friends were at a meeting for a project, and everything was going normal until Jane looked at one of her friends and he didn't seem normal at all. So Jane obviously would ask them, "Are you okay?" And well, they would lightly say that, "Yeah, everything's okay, I just got bit by a spider." Which instantly Jane thought to the worst outcome, and she thought that he could have been poisoned. So in a panic, Jane and her two friends got into the car and they sped off to the hospital. And well, pretty quickly they would get to the hospital, and Jane and her friends would rush inside the hospital, and the friend who got bit would get treated. And well, once the friend got treated, Jane looked at both of them and told them that, "I'll head out early and go get the car around at the front, so it saves you guys from walking." And so they would all agree, and then 3 minutes later, the two friends that were in the hospital still would come out to the front. And pretty quickly they saw Jane's car coming towards them, but not in a normal speed. The car was coming quite fast. And the two friends instantly noticed that the car wasn't slowing down, and it looked like that Jane was just going to pass through them. And well, the car zoomed past the two friends and turned into the main road and just disappeared. And the two friends stood in front of the hospital, just jaws wide open and confused to what they have just witnessed. Thus, today's story that I'm about to tell you is known to be famous and for being such a creepy and puzzling story. But before we begin, if you enjoy true crime stories or just scary stories in general, then I highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do and I upload once a week. And also a massive shout out to all 397 of you guys. It really does mean a lot. But with all that being said, let's begin. This story begins on April 12, 1948. A young woman by the name of Dorothy Jane would be born into this world, and all of her childhood she would be known as a quiet kid. But in fact, she didn't even care that she got this title. In fact, she actually embraced this title. And so she would cruise through the school years and in her teenage years. And during this time, she would fully involve herself in her Christian belief. You see, both of Jane's parents were quite strict Christians. And well, at this age, lots of kids would like to drink and go party, but not Jane though. Every time she got invited to parties, she would deny it. And obviously, since her parents were Christians, she wouldn't drink at all. So really missing out on that hedonistic lifestyle brought her closer to her religion and ultimately made her fall in love with it. And for majority of her teenage years, that's how it would go, until she met a man who was also Christian. And pretty quickly they would fall in love with each other and get married. And just as quickly as they fell in love, Jane would also be pregnant with a baby boy. But even though everything was going well for Jane, over the next couple of years it wouldn't be the same. Jane and her husband would constantly argue, and it got to the point where they would just argue about the smallest things. And well, after a while, Jane's husband just had enough, and he would leave Jane. And at this point, Jane would feel so bad, not for her, but for her 4-year-old son at this point. But instead of just sitting there being depressed and not really doing anything with her life, she decided that she would move closer to her family, as she had moved further away from them when she got married. And so she would move back to Stanton, California, where she used to live with her auntie. And so pretty quickly she would begin working again, and she actually got a job at a psychoelectric item store. And if you don't know what that is, it's just a small store that sells mainly things like love beads and other small things. This shop wasn't the only shop that she worked at. Right next to this store was another store called the Head Shop, which sold other sorts of things that different people would buy. And Jane would work at both of these shops for a while. While she was working, she would leave her son with her aunt, and after work she would just come straight home, and that's how life went for her. But this is where the story really begins. On a cold morning, Jane would come in for work, and she would open the shutters and flip the open sign on, and then she went to the back and started counting on the stock that she had for the day, and overall just getting ready for the day. The store phone rang, and so calmly Jane walked to the phone, looked at it, picked it up, and on the other side of this phone was a male voice saying, "Hello, Jane." And of course Jane felt a bit creeped out and said hello back, and also, "How can I help you?" And this unknown man, who we're going to identify as the caller, would confess his love to her. So taken aback, Jane would say thank you, but no thank you, and would say this is certainly not the time for this. The man would stay silent on the other side, and then would proceed to say, "I'll kill you." And at first Jane thought that this was some sort of weird prank, but the man would continue to rant on about how he's going to kill Jane and how your time is coming to an end, and he would keep going and going until suddenly the phone line cut out. And so Jane's heart's now racing, and she begins to look around, feeling like somebody's watching her, but she quickly finds out that nobody's watching her. And so she quickly composes herself as customers are starting to come in, and somehow she'd continue the day without really thinking about that phone call, until the next day would come rolling around, and where now she's at work doing her normal things that she would usually do, and again she would get a phone call. She walked up to the phone, still a bit shooken up from the day before, and she slowly picked it up and put the phone to her ear, and to her horror, the caller was on the phone. And before she could even cut the line, she heard the caller say, "On your call, I left a special gift for you. And as soon as he says that, the line cuts out. So now again, Jane's heart's racing and she runs straight outside and looks in front of a car, and there, sitting on her windshield, was a dead Rose. And now Jane is just freaking out because she knows that whoever this caller is knows where she works, and he's probably watching her right now. And still somehow Jane finishes her shift, and as soon as she's done, she clocks out and gets in a car and speeds right off home. So when she gets back home, she tells her aunt that this is what's happening with me. Some guy is calling me and just giving me threats, and he knows where I work now. And her aunt would tell her to call the police, but Jane knew that the police couldn't really do much, as they really couldn't track this guy down. So she would tell her aunt that it's fine, I'm just gonna wait and hopefully this goes away. But unfortunately that wait doesn't last long, because the next day Jane would get a phone call again, but this time in her house. And this call would send Jane into a straight panic mode. The call was from the caller, and he would just straight up and tell her that,
"Now you come my way, and when I get you alone, I will cut you up into small bits so no one will ever find you."
And now Jane begins to scream and shout to leave me alone. And after she calmed down, she thought to herself that maybe I need to protect myself by getting a gun. But she thought about it for a while, and she knew that since she had a 4-year-old son, and having a gun laying around is just not the best thing. So instead of that, she went for plan B. She opted for karate classes to teach her self-defense, in hopes of one day if she runs into this person, she could at least have a fighting chance of surviving. But after that call, nothing much happened until May 27th, 1980, so just a couple of months after. Jane was working at her job, and well, it was that time of the month, meetings, and so her and her two co-workers, Conrad Boston and Pam Head, walked into the office and sat down. And while they were in this meeting, Jane couldn't help herself looking at Conrad, who went from a normal happy face to a dark gloomy one, almost like he was ill. So Jane would proceed to ask him, "Hey Conrad, what's up? You don't seem in the usual mood that you're usually in." And he would just say, "Oh, nothing, I just feel a bit sick." Jane knew that there was something more to this, so she would push him for a better answer, until Conrad finally gave up and just told her that, "I got bit by a spider, and not just any spider. I saw a bit of red on it, so I think it's a black widow spider." And as soon as Jane heard this, she began to yell at Conrad by saying, "You know, if you just keep that untreated, you'll die." And Conrad would just casually tell her that, "Yeah, but I'll be fine, don't worry." But of course Jane wasn't having none of it, and she would tell Conrad that we need to go to the hospital. So her and Conrad would excuse themselves, but Pam decided to join in as well. So pretty quickly the three friends would hop into Jane's white 1973 Toyota. But since this is the 1980s, you don't have cell phones, so you would have to go to someone's house to tell them what you're doing. And so Jane went to her aunt's house and told her aunt that, "Hey, I'm going to the hospital because my friend got bit by a spider and we think it's pretty poisonous." And her aunt would say, "Yeah, that's fine, just make sure you be safe." And the two women went their separate ways. And a quick detail, Jane actually changed her headscarf. She was wearing a red one, but she changed it to a black one. And about 5 minutes later, the friends would arrive at UCI Medical Center. And when they got into the hospital, Conrad was rushed in, while Jane and Pam sat down in the waiting area watching TV and reading magazines until 11 PM came around and Conrad was released. But before Conrad could leave, he needed to go to the pharmacy to fill out his prescription so he could get the right medications to cure him. And Jane decided that you two go do that, and I'll go bring the cart around from the back to the front so you don't have to walk too far. And so the three agreed, and 10 minutes later Conrad and Pam would arrive at the front of the hospital, and they would just stand outside at the front door and they waited, but there was no sign of Jane. So they decided that Jane must have got a flat tire or something, so they headed towards the car park where Jane was originally parked. And as soon as they turned into the car park, they saw Jane's car, and it was on with its headbeams on fully. And as they were looking, they noticed that the car was coming towards them, so of course they stood still. But as they were standing still, they noticed that the car wasn't slowing down, as it usually should if you're picking someone up. And well, pretty quickly the car would just zoom past them and turn onto the main road and just speed off. So Pam and Conrad would just look at each other like, what the hell just happened? But they decided to wait for Jane, just in case that Jane had an emergency and she needed to rush off quickly. And they waited for a couple of hours until they asked the hospital security, did something happen to Jane, because she just left without us. And the security found that strange as well, as they saw her going into the restroom and then exiting the front door. And so the two friends would wait even more until they decided to call Jane's parents, and they would tell Jane's parents what just happened. And even they were like, we don't know why Jane would do that, and we have no idea where she is. And well, just like that, Jane would be missing until 5 AM came. So basically the following morning, Jane's car was found in some alley 10 miles away from the actual hospital. And well, the car was actually on fire. And well, the police were just stunned because they don't know why this would happen or who did this, because Jane wouldn't just set her car on fire, as she really needed that to go to work. And it doesn't stop there though. About a week after Jane's disappearance, her mother, who was called Vera, got calls from the same caller that called Jane, and he began to ask Vera that, are "Are you related to Jane?" And obviously Vera would say, "Yes, I am related to her." And then he would proceed to tell her that, "I have her." And as soon as he said that, the line cut out. Jane's family would inform the police of this call and would inform the police about the many calls that she got from this exact caller. And for weeks, search parties were sent out high and low just to find Jane. But unfortunately, as many of these stories go, they found nothing. Jane's family took this to the local news and offered a 25k reward for any leads for Jane, and unfortunately no one stepped forward and gave them any information. A month later, a man named Pat Riley, who was an editorial manager for the newspaper, received a phone call from the same man who kidnapped Jane, and he began to scream down the phone saying, "I killed her, I killed Jane Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man, and she tried to lie to me, so I killed her." He then began to reveal clues that have been withheld from the public about the night that Jane got abducted, such as Conrad's spider bite and what colour Jane's headscarf was, which he would go on to say black. And remember, she changed it halfway through, heading towards a hospital. He would also claim that Jane had called him in the hospital, which made no sense because she was with Pam. But Jane did go to the toilet, and well, she could have called him during that time and when she went to the car. But the man kept on going about how he felt like he and her were in a relationship, and that her talking to another man in the hospital was considered as cheating. But a point that still remains is that, how could that man be on the phone and then a couple of seconds later be in Jane's car? And there were no cell phones, and he needed to use a landline, and there was no telephone boxes nearby the hospital. But either way, for the next 3 years, Jane's stalker would call Jane's parents over and over and over again, and the police tapped into the home phone in the hopes of locating Jane's abductor. And unfortunately, he would never stay on the line for long enough for the police to catch him. And at this point, it felt like Jane's parents were just being stalked now, and he would only call Vera, the mother, if she was home alone. But one day, Vera's husband, Sean, the father, would actually answer the phone, and after that call, the call stopped until the news came about that Jane's remains have been found. And after that, the phone calls would start again, and every time Vera would answer this phone, she would hear the man say, "Is Jane home?" before hanging the phone up. Jane's family would not change the home line in hopes that Jane's abductor would allow them to speak to Jane, because in their mind they thought that the remains that the police found wasn't Jane. There wasn't many suspects for the police to go around with, since Jane didn't really have a boyfriend, and the fact that she didn't go out as much and didn't have many friends, so there wasn't really many people that the police could eye on. Jane's ex-husband was crossed off as a suspect because he was at Missouri at the time of Jane's disappearance. But in 2017, Sean Scott, Jane's son, he named the brother of a co-worker that Jane used to work with, was apparently obsessed with Jane. Sean would also say that the police actually had an eye on this guy, but never had enough evidence to fully charge him. And well, the alleged suspect would die in 2014, and so we don't know who took Jane and why they would do this horrific crime. So that'll be it for today's video. If you enjoy true crime stories or just scary stories in general, I would highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel. That's all I do, and I upload once a week. And also, again, a massive shout out to 397 subscribers, and I can't thank you guys enough. And also, before I end the video, comment below what your thoughts are on this case. Who do you think could have took Jane? But with all that being said, thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.